Welcome everyone to my channel, Bedtime Story. Have a great day.
The last time I saw my daughter, she was 7 years old. She walked out the back door of our house on a Saturday morning in March of 2005 and did not come back. No note, no witnesses, no explanation that survived the first week of investigation. Just a child-shaped absence that I carried in my chest for 22 years, the kind of wound that never closes properly because closing would have meant accepting she was gone. And I was never able to do that. I am a surgeon. I have spent 28 years knowing exactly what wounds need to close and what wounds need to stay open. This one stayed open because something below the level of reason understood that the bleeding meant I was still looking. For 22 years, I looked. And for 22 years, every Friday night, my best friend of 30 years sat across from me at a corner table on Westheimer, refilled my glass, and told me I had done everything I could. He was lying. He had known where she was from the beginning. He had known when he recommended the investigator I hired. He had known every Friday night when he watched me fall apart and said the things a good friend says to a man who is breaking. He had known for 22 years, and he had said nothing. Because her being lost was worth more to him than her being found. I did not know any of that yet on the night I am about to tell you about. What I knew was this. I was 61 years old, sitting at a charity dinner in Dallas, and the woman across the table had just pushed up her sleeve, and I saw the scar I had put on my daughter's wrist when she was 5 years old. 7 stitches. My hands. Still there. She had been out there the whole time, and the person I trusted most had known exactly where. The ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton Dallas holds 400 people. I know this because I have attended this gala 11 consecutive years, and I have never once felt comfortable in it, not because of the room, which is beautiful, but because I am not a man who has ever learned to occupy success without thinking about what it cost. My foundation sponsors the event. That is why I come. Aldridge Children's Foundation puts $300,000 annually into pediatric health in rural Texas, and the people in this room make that possible. Showing up is the least I can do. Table 9. To my left, a cardiologist from Baylor who talked about golf. Across from me, a group of young physicians just back from 2 years in East Africa, that particular quality you see in doctors who have worked with nothing. A quiet efficiency. The look of people who have stopped being impressed by rooms like this one. I liked them immediately. Gary Hoffman sat 2 seats to my left, deep in conversation with the cardiologist, laughing at something. Gary laughs easily. 30 years of friendship, and I had never seen him struggle to find something to enjoy in a room. That evening, I was still thinking of it as a gift. One of the young physicians was doing most of the talking. A woman, early 30s, dark hair pulled back, navy blazer. The precise speech of someone who had spent years presenting cases to senior physicians who did not have time for imprecision. She was describing a surgical case from Kenya, a child. Complicated laceration. Improvised technique. Her hands moved as she talked, sketching the procedure above her dinner plate. Then she reached across the table for the water pitcher, her sleeve pulled back. I saw the scar. Left wrist. Inside. A small raised line, pale against her skin, shaped like the letter T, 7 millimeters. Slightly irregular at the top where tension had pulled the tissue just enough to leave a characteristic curve. I know that scar. I made that scar 22 years ago, in the kitchen of my house in Houston Heights. My daughter fell from the oak tree in the backyard. She was 5 years old. The laceration was deep enough to need suturing. My wife wanted to take her to the emergency room. I said there was no need. I was a pediatric surgeon. I sutured it myself. 7 sutures. Interrupted technique. 4/0 nylon. Precise. Because I could not be anything else when it was her. The scar that formed was small and pale and shaped by some accident of tension and tissue. Like the letter T, she asked me what the T stood for. I told her it stood for Thomas, her father's name, a little piece of me she would always carry. She was 5 years old. She thought that was the best thing she had ever heard. She disappeared 3 years later, and I had spent every year since carrying the other half of that story in my chest, like a second wound, the one that never closed, because I never let it. The woman across the table set the water pitcher down and continued talking. Her sleeve settled back over her wrist. The conversation moved on. Gary laughed at something. The chandeliers held their position above us. Indifferent and expensive. I picked up my fork, set it down, picked up my water glass, drank. My left hand, beneath the table, was shaking. I am 61 years old. I spent 28 years as a pediatric surgeon. I have delivered news to parents that no parent should ever receive. And I have done it without my voice breaking. Because breaking was not something I could afford. I know how to hold myself together when everything in me wants to come apart. I held myself together. For the next 40 minutes, I participated in the conversation at Table 9. I answered questions about the foundation. I asked the young physicians about Kenya. I listened to the cardiologist talk about his handicap. I smiled at the right moments. I did not look at her wrist again. I did not need to. The image was already fixed behind my eyes with the permanence of things that matter too much to forget. At the end of the evening, I approached the group with business cards. Professional context. The foundation was always looking for physicians interested in rural Texas outreach. She took my card and read it. Thomas Aldridge, Aldridge Children's Foundation. Founder. Her name was Claire Bennett, 31 years old, pediatric physician, recently back from Kenya. Texas rural health sounded interesting. She would be in touch. We shook hands. Her grip was firm and her eyes were direct. She did not look like someone who needed anything from me, which is exactly the kind of person I have always respected most. Gary appeared at my elbow as she walked away. Good event. He said, Friday dinner. The usual place, I said yes. Of course. Friday. I drove back to my hotel alone, sat on the edge of the bed in my charcoal suit, opened my laptop, typed her name into the search bar. Claire Bennett, MD. Results came back in under a second. 22 years is a long time to carry something. Long enough that you learn to carry it without showing. Long enough that you almost believe you have made peace with it. I had not forgotten what that scar looked like. I had never once forgotten. I had to know. And I was terrified of what knowing would cost the man I had trusted most. I began to read. The search results told me she was a pediatric physician based in Denver, Colorado, board certified, Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, 2 years in Kenya. Before that, undergraduate biology at the University of Colorado, where she had grown up, grew up in Colorado. I closed the laptop at 2:17 in the morning and did not sleep. I drove back to Houston the next day. 4 hours on I-45 with the radio off. I did not call anyone. I drove the way I used to drive home after a difficult case mechanically, letting the road pass beneath me while my mind worked somewhere else entirely. The house in Houston Heights looks the same as it did in 2002. I have repainted twice. Replaced the back fence in 2016. The oak tree in the backyard is taller now, thicker through the trunk. Everything else is the same. I did not move after Claire disappeared. Everyone said I should. Margaret said it too. Gently. Twice. In the early years of our marriage, I told her I could not leave. The truth was simple. If Claire ever came back, I needed her to know where to find me. I went to my office, third drawer, left side of the desk. I have opened that drawer every morning for 22 years. Inside, in a manila folder gone soft at the edges from handling, is everything that remains of the official search. Police reports, investigator summaries. The last photograph taken of her red sweater, hair in 2 braids, standing in the backyard looking up at the oak tree. She was 6 years old. She looks exactly like what she was, a child in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Not yet aware that ordinary afternoons are something you can lose. I set the photograph on the desk, opened my laptop, went back to the search results. Claire Bennett, born February 2002. Adopted November 2002 by Robert and Susan Morrison of Denver, Colorado. November 2002. My daughter disappeared in March 2005. When she was 7 years old, a child adopted in November 2002 as an infant would have been 3 years old when my daughter disappeared. The dates did not match. The ages did not match. I sat with that for a long time. Then I looked at the photograph. Then I looked at the screen. Then I thought about the scar, the precise shape of it. The characteristic curve at the top that I had watched form over 3 weeks of healing in the autumn of 2002. My daughter was born in September of 1997. She was 4 years old in the autumn of 2002. Not an infant. I searched deeper. Private adoption records, processed through a law firm rather than an agency, sealed, as most private adoptions are. But one archived filing listed the child's approximate age at placement as 4 to 5 years. Not an infant. 4 to 5 years old. Denver. November 2002. I pulled out the second folder. 22 years of monthly reports from Raymond Voss, the private investigator Gary had recommended 6 weeks after Claire disappeared. Gary had vouched for him personally. Best in the business. I've known him for years. Trust me on this one. I had trusted him. For 22 years, I had read every report, paid every invoice, accepted every carefully worded update about leads requiring more time, investigations requiring continuation, promising directions that never produced results but always justified another month of billing. I opened the first report, then the 5th, then the 12th. Raymond Voss had never once, in 264 monthly reports, written that he had checked a specific location and found nothing. Not once. No negative results. No closed doors. No definitive dead ends. Only leads that needed more time. I am a physician. I was trained to document everything what I found, what I did not find, what I ruled out and why. Negative findings are findings. They prove you did the work. A private investigator who never documents a negative result is not investigating. He is managing information. I searched Voss online. His current website listed one office, Houston, Texas, but an archived version from 2003 showed something the current version did not. A second office, Denver, Colorado. Open 2001. Closed 2006. Denver. I looked at the photograph on my desk. then the screen. Then I picked up my phone and found the email from 2002. Gary Hoffman. 1 week after Claire disappeared. Tom, I know a guy. Raymond Voss. Best in the business. I've known him for years. Trust me on this one. Trust me on this one. I read that sentence 4 times. Set the phone face down on the desk. Gary Hoffman. 30 years of friendship. The man who stood next to me at my wedding, who sat beside me through every meeting with the police in those first terrible weeks, who had shown up at my door the night Claire disappeared and stayed until 3 a.m. without being asked. The man who had recommended the investigator. The man who had said, "Trust me." Raymond Voss. Denver office opened 2001, 1 year before Claire disappeared. Closed 2006, 1 year after the Morrison family adoption was finalized. Outside. Houston was doing what it does in November. Gray sky. Air too warm for the season. The particular flatness of a city that does not believe in change. I had lived here 33 years, built everything I had here. My career, my foundation, my friendship with Gary Hoffman. I had trusted him on this one. I was only beginning to understand what that trust had cost me. I called Raymond Voss at 7 the next morning. He picked up on the second ring. That was the first thing that struck me. Not the greeting, not the voice, the speed. A man who answers his phone on the second ring at 7 in the morning is either expecting a call or always expecting a call. 22 years of monthly check-ins, and I had never once called outside our scheduled time. He picked up anyway. As if he had been waiting, I told him I had some questions about the search. Routine. I said, "Just reviewing some old files." He said, "Of course. Anything he could help with." I asked about Denver, Colorado, whether he had ever investigated that direction in the early years. A pause. Not long. Half a second. Maybe less. Then no. He said, Denver had never come up as a viable direction. The evidence had always pointed elsewhere. I asked him to be specific. Where had the evidence pointed? He listed several states: California, Oregon, Arizona, the Southwest. Generally, he used phrases I recognized from his reports, promising indicators, active leads, continued monitoring. The same language he had used for 22 years. Smooth and professional and completely empty of specifics. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I carried every report box from the storage shelf in my office and set them on the floor. 264 monthly summaries, arranged chronologically. Going back to May of 2002, I sat down beside them and started reading, not the way I had read them before, hoping for news, scanning for names, looking for the lead that would finally mean something. I read them the way I used to review surgical records when something had gone wrong, and I needed to understand exactly where and how and why. Looking for what was not there. Raymond Voss, in 22 years of reports, had never written a single negative result. Not one. He had never written that he had traveled to a specific location and found nothing. Never written that a witness had no useful information. Never closed a single line of inquiry with a definitive ruling. Every report described leads requiring more time. Every report justified continuation. Every report ended with some version of the same sentence: the investigation is ongoing, and I remain committed to finding answers. 264 reports. Not one closed door. I thought about what I had told medical students for 20 years. Document everything, what you found and what you did not find. Negative results prove you did the work. A physician who only documents positive findings is not practicing medicine. He is constructing a narrative. I cross-referenced the reports against my own calendar. Every time I had mentioned a specific geographic area to Voss during our monthly calls, I checked what happened in the following report. The pattern was consistent. If I had mentioned a lead in California, the next report contained a promising California development. If I mentioned Arizona, Arizona appeared. The investigation followed my suggestions. Not evidence. The investigation had been a mirror, reflecting back whatever I brought to it. I pulled up the archived website again. Denver office, 2001 to 2006. Opened before Claire disappeared. Closed after the Morrison adoption was finalized. I wrote those dates on a notepad and looked at them for a while. Then I called my attorney. I asked for help locating corporate filings for a company called Hoffman and Associates LLC, registered in Houston, Texas, sometime around 2002. She called back in 30 minutes. Hoffman and Associates LLC. Articles of incorporation filed March 2001. Business purpose listed as private legal consulting and adoption facilitation. Registered agent Gary Allen Hoffman. With a Houston address I recognized immediately. Gary's house. The house I had been to hundreds of times over 30 years. Dissolved 2004. I wrote the name on the notepad beneath the dates. Gary Allen Hoffman. I set the pen down. Looked at what I had written. Outside my office window. A neighbor was walking a dog. Normal Tuesday morning. The kind of morning that does not know what is happening inside the houses it passes. Gary had recommended Voss in 2002. That same year. Gary's private company, a company I had never heard of. A company he had never mentioned, was facilitating adoptions in the same city where a 4 to 5-year-old girl with a T-shaped scar on her left wrist had been placed with a family named Morrison. He did not just recommend the man who hid her. He built the machine that did it. And then he sat across from me every Friday night and watched me fall apart. I drove to Gary's house that afternoon without calling first. In 30 years of friendship, I had never done that. We were people who called ahead, people who confirmed plans, who respected schedules, who understood that showing up unannounced was a particular kind of intrusion. That afternoon, I did not care. I needed to look at him. I needed to see his face when I said certain words and watch what happened behind his eyes. He answered the door in a weekend shirt, coffee in hand. The particular ease of a man with nowhere to be. His face did, when he saw me, what it always did, opened into something warm and familiar. The expression of a man genuinely glad to see his oldest friend. Good surprise. He said, "Come in." I went in. We sat in his kitchen. He poured me coffee I did not drink. He talked about the gala, good turnout. Good energy. The foundation was in strong shape. He talked about a case he had handled that week. A difficult intubation. The kind of story he told well. I listened and watched and said the right things at the right intervals. Then I said I had been reviewing some old files, the Voss reports. I mentioned Denver, Colorado, casually. The way you mentioned something that has just occurred to you. Gary's expression did not change. Not a flicker. He said Denver had never seemed like a viable direction. Voss had explained that thoroughly at the time. He thought, didn't he? Yes. I said, he had. I drove home 20 minutes later and sat in my office without turning on the lights. 30 years. I have known Gary Hoffman for 30 years. We met the first week of residency, two young physicians who understood immediately that survival required allies. We had worked the same brutal hours. failed the same impossible exams, celebrated the same hard-won victories. He was the best man at my first wedding. He was the first person I called when Claire disappeared. He sat in this house until 3 in the morning that first night, saying nothing particularly useful and everything necessary. I thought about the Friday nights, every Friday for 22 years, with interruptions only for travel or illness. Gary and I had met at the same bar on Westheimer, same corner table, same order. We had talked about work, about life, about the search. He had listened to every update, every frustration, every moment I thought I had found something and then hadn't. He had refilled my glass and said the things a good friend says. "You've done everything you could, Tom. No one could have done more." I opened my email archive and searched Gary's name. I was not certain what I was looking for. I was looking for something wrong, some thread that did not belong. The way you look at a patient's file when the diagnosis doesn't fit the symptoms and you know you have missed something. I found it in 2008, an email from Gary to an address I did not recognize. A personal account, not his hospital address. Sent on a Saturday morning the day after one of our Friday nights. The email was 4 paragraphs long. It described, in specific detail, the conversation we had the night before, my current emotional state, the geographic areas I was focusing on, the specific lead I had mentioned, a reported sighting in Northern California that Voss had flagged as promising. The email ended with 2 sentences. He's still looking north. Keep Voss pointed that direction for another month. I read it twice, then a third time. 22 years of Friday nights. 22 years of bourbon and low lighting and the particular comfort of a man who knew exactly how I thought. Exactly what I needed to hear. Exactly how much hope I could sustain before it became dangerous. I had believed those evenings were the one thing keeping me functional, the one reliable constant in a life that had lost its center. He had been filing reports. Every conversation I had, trusted him with every moment of vulnerability, every admission of desperation. Every time I had said I was thinking of stopping and he had talked me back from the edge had been logged and transmitted to the man he had hired to make sure I never found my daughter. He had not just recommended Raymond Voss, he had managed me through Voss for 22 years, adjusting the direction of the false investigation based on what I told him every Friday night over bourbon at our corner table on Westheimer. I printed the email, set it on the desk next to the notepad with his name on it. 2 pieces of paper. The company he built to hide her. The system he ran to keep me blind. For 22 years, I thought Friday nights were the one thing keeping me sane. Turns out, they were the one thing keeping me lost. The Harris County Business Records Office opens at 8 in the morning. I was there at 8:15 with a notepad and the name of a company that had existed for 3 years and then disappeared. The clerk pulled the file without comment. Hoffman and Associates, LLC. Articles of incorporation. Operating agreements. Dissolution papers. I sat at the reading table and went through every page. The company had been registered in March of 2001. Business purpose, private legal consulting, and adoption facilitation. Gary's home address listed as the registered office. A second address appeared in the operating documents, a suite in a building on Westheimer that I knew had housed various small professional offices over the years. I had driven past it hundreds of times without knowing what was inside. The financial records told the clearest story. A wire transfer received in October of 2002. The originating account belonged to Sandra Aldridge, my ex-wife. 3 months after Claire disappeared, and 1 month before a 4 to 5-year-old girl with a T-shaped scar was placed with the Morrison family in Denver. The amount was $60,000. I wrote the number on my notepad, set the pen down, looked at the number for a while. Sandra and I had divorced in 2001, 1 year before Claire disappeared. The marriage had failed the way some marriages fail, not dramatically, not with betrayal or cruelty, but with distance. I had worked too much and been present too little, and eventually there was nothing left between us except a child we both loved and a house we could not both live in. The divorce was difficult, but not vicious. I had believed, in the years since, that we had reached a kind of peace with it. $60,000 wired to Gary Hoffman's company 3 months after our daughter vanished told a different story. I photocopied the relevant pages, returned the file, and drove home. That evening, I found the video on my laptop, the recording from Margaret's memorial service in 2019. I had not watched it since the week after her funeral. I had not been able to. I watched it now. Gary spoke for 4 minutes. He was composed and graceful, the way Gary always is in rooms that require composure and grace. He talked about Margaret's warmth, her intelligence, her steadiness. He talked about what she had meant to Thomas, how she had brought light back into a life that had known significant darkness. The congregation was visibly moved. Several people wiped their eyes. I remembered sitting in the front pew and feeling, for a moment, that the words were the truest thing anyone had said that day. Then Gary said the sentence I had not thought about since. Margaret always believed Thomas would find peace someday. I hope he does. I truly do. I paused the video. I sat looking at Gary's frozen face on the screen, composed, sincere, the face of a man delivering a genuine wish for his oldest friend's well-being. He had known where Claire was for 17 years when he stood at that podium. He had known she was alive, that she was in Denver, that she had grown into a physician, that she was 30 years old and building a life. He had known all of that. And he had stood in that church and expressed his hope that I would find peace someday. Not that I would find her, that I would find peace. The distinction had not registered when I first heard it. It registered now with the particular clarity of something that has been true for a long time and has finally been seen. I closed the laptop. My phone was on the desk. There was an email I had not yet opened from a law firm I did not recognize, received 3 days ago, sitting in my inbox beneath foundation correspondence and hospital newsletters. I opened it now. The sender was an attorney named Patricia Weil. The email was brief. She wrote that she represented the estate of Margaret Aldridge, and that Margaret had left specific instructions regarding a document to be delivered to Thomas Aldridge under particular circumstances. Margaret had told her that Thomas would contact her when he was ready to ask the right question, Patricia Weil believed. Based on the nature of my inquiry to her office earlier that week, that I was now ready, she asked if I could come to her office the following morning. I read the email twice. Then I looked at the paused video on my laptop, Gary's face, mid-sentence, expressing his sincere hope for my peace. Margaret had known something. She had known it long enough to leave instructions with an attorney. She had known it and had waited not because she did not care, but because she had loved me carefully enough to wait until I was ready. The least I could do was finally be ready to listen. Patricia Weil's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, 3 blocks from the hospital where Margaret had spent her final 6 weeks. I had driven past that building every day for a year after her death, without being able to look at it directly. That morning, I parked in the garage beneath it and took the elevator up without stopping. The attorney was a small woman in her 60s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the careful manner of someone who has delivered difficult things to people for a long time. She did not offer condolences. She had learned, I assumed, that condolences 4 years after the fact serve mostly the person offering them. She offered coffee instead, which I accepted and did not drink. She placed a notebook on the table between us, navy blue cover, small, the kind sold at drugstores. Margaret's handwriting on the first page, in the black ink she always used for Thomas. When he's ready. I recognized the handwriting the way you recognize something that has been part of your daily life for years and then suddenly isn't. She had been gone 4 years. The handwriting still looked like her. I thanked Patricia Weil and took the notebook to the elevator and rode down 16 floors and sat in my car in the parking garage and opened it. The first entry was dated March of 2016, 7 years ago, 3 years before Margaret died. I don't know how to say this to him. I don't know if I'm right. I hope I'm wrong. But I have been watching Gary Hoffman for 2 years now, and there are things I cannot explain. She had written in her careful, deliberate hand the handwriting of a woman who chose her words before she committed them to paper. She described what she had observed. Gary's questions about the investigation always specific, always directed, always arriving just after Thomas had mentioned a new development. The way he steered conversations away from certain directions. The way he never expressed frustration when Voss reported nothing, only relief. Quickly concealed, that she had learned to recognize over months of watching. Then an entry from 2017. He said Denver today. We were talking about nothing, the weather. The drive from the hospital, and he said Denver and then stopped himself. Finished the sentence differently. I wrote down the exact words. I wrote down the date and time. I don't know what it means yet, but I know it means something. The date and time were there, exactly as she had described. The precise sentence Gary had started and abandoned. She had recorded it the way a physician records an anomalous finding without interpretation, without conclusion, with only the fact itself preserved for later examination. I turned pages. The entries continued through 2018. Smaller observations, larger patterns. A visit Gary had made to the house while Thomas was at the foundation, asking Margaret questions about the investigation that he had no professional reason to ask. A phone call she had overheard, brief and low-voiced. That ended the moment Gary saw her in the doorway. The final entries were written in a different hand, shakier, the hand of a woman who was already ill. I think she's alive. Thomas, I have believed this for 2 years, and I have not told you because I could not prove it, and because I was afraid of what it would do to you if I was wrong. I am more afraid now of what it will do to you if I am right, and you never know. I love you enough to be wrong about this, but I love you too much not to write it down. The answer is closer than you think. It has always been closer than you think. I sat in the parking garage for a long time. The thing about grief is that you believe, after enough years, that you have mapped its full territory, that there are no rooms left you have not entered, no specific pain you have not already felt and survived. Margaret had been gone 4 years. I had believed I knew the shape of losing her. I had not known about this room. She had spent 3 years watching, recording, protecting me from a knowledge she was not yet certain of. And then she had spent her final months making sure that if she was right, I would eventually find out. She had loved me carefully enough to wait. carefully enough to leave a map. I took out my phone. I did not call my attorney. I did not call the police. I typed a short email to the address on the business card I had kept in my wallet for 5 days. Dr. Bennett, this is Thomas Aldridge. I need to show you something. Are you available this week? I looked at the email for a moment. Then I looked at the notebook in my lap, navy blue cover. Margaret's handwriting. 3 years of careful watching distilled into something small enough to hold in one hand. She had kept looking, even after she was gone. The least I could do was finally act. I pressed send. She replied within the hour. Dr. Aldridge, I've been waiting for someone to contact me. I just didn't expect it to be you. Tomorrow works. There's a coffee shop on Montrose I like. 9 o'clock. I arrived at 8:50. Old habit. I have spent 30 years arriving early to rooms where difficult things were going to happen. It gives you time to settle, to arrange yourself, to decide how you want to occupy the space before anyone else enters it. The coffee shop was small and unpretentious. Mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu, the smell of something baking, the kind of place chosen by someone who was not trying to impress anyone. She walked in at 9 exactly. Navy jacket, dark hair down today. She moved through the room the way she had moved through the ballroom in Dallas, with the directness of someone who had decided early on that hesitation was a form of imprecision she could not afford. She saw me, came to the table, sat down without preamble. She did not extend her hand. Neither did I. We looked at each other for a moment in the particular way of two people who have something large and unspoken between them. I opened the folder I had brought. I did not explain. I simply placed the documents on the table, one at a time, and let her read. The Hoffman and Associates Incorporation papers, the financial record showing Sandra's transfer, the Denver adoption filing with its age notation 4 to 5 years, the Voss report archive summary, with the pattern of misdirection documented and annotated, the email from 2008. She read everything without speaking. She read the way I imagine she reads patient files methodically, completely, without letting her face tell me what she was finding. When she finished, she set the last page down and looked at the table for a moment before looking at me. You've known about me for how long? She said, 5 days. I said, since the gala. She nodded slowly. I've been looking for 3 years. She said, since I was 28. I found the gaps in my own history, the things my parents told me that didn't add up, the records that didn't quite connect. I knew I had been adopted privately. I knew there was something the official story wasn't telling me. I hired someone to look into it, but the trail went cold in Houston. I couldn't get past the sealed records. She paused. Then she said there was a man. I waited. About a year ago. She said, in Denver. He approached me outside my building, said he was an old family friend, that he knew things about my biological family, that he could tell me who my father was. She stopped. Her hands were flat on the table. He wanted $40,000 for the information. I looked at her hands. Steady. The hands of a surgeon who has learned not to let what she is feeling travel to her fingers. What did you do? I said. I told him no. She said, I called the police. He was gone before they arrived. I didn't have a name for him. I had a description, but descriptions don't get you very far. I reached into the folder and took out the last item, a photograph. Gary Hoffman at the Foundation Gala 2 years ago, smiling at something, clear and well lit. I placed it on the table between us and said nothing. She looked at the photograph. Something changed in her face, not dramatically, not the way it happens in films, just a small, precise shift. The kind of change that happens when a fact lands somewhere it cannot be undone. Yes, she said. That's him. I looked at the photograph of my oldest friend, the man who had attended my wedding, the man who had sat beside me through the worst nights of my life, the man who had, apparently, traveled to Denver and attempted to sell my daughter information about her own father. He's been my best friend for 30 years, I said. She absorbed that. Then he asked $40,000 for information about my own father. Yes. She looked out the window at Montrose Avenue, a Tuesday morning in Houston. Ordinary traffic, ordinary light. I thought about what Gary had known when he flew to Denver. He had known she was a physician. He had known she was looking for her biological family. He had known exactly who she was and exactly what that information would mean to her. And he had decided that knowledge was worth $40,000. He had not merely hidden her from me for 22 years, when she had begun looking for herself. He had tried to profit from that too. I taught Gary Hoffman everything I knew about loyalty. I said, turns out he used every lesson to build the most precise betrayal I have ever seen. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, we need a lawyer. Yes, I said. We do. She looked back from the window. Her eyes were steady, and her voice was level, and she looked. Sitting across from me in that small coffee shop on Montrose. Exactly like someone who had spent her whole life preparing for a conversation she had not known she was preparing for. We need a lawyer. She had said, not I. We. It was the first word she had used that included both of us. The attorney's name was Sandra Okafor. Claire had recommended her a former federal prosecutor who now handled complex civil and criminal cases. Known, Claire said, for being methodical and difficult to surprise. We met in her office at 8:30 the following morning. I spread the documents across her conference table. The Hoffman and Associates Incorporation papers, the financial transfer from Sandra Aldridge, the Denver adoption filing, the Voss report archive with the pattern of misdirection annotated, the email from 2008, Margaret's notebook. Sandra Okafor read everything without speaking. She made notes on a legal pad in small, precise handwriting. When she finished, she set down her pen and looked at the table for a moment before looking at us. The documentary evidence is strong. She said, the notebook is compelling, but it's corroborating. It establishes awareness and intent rather than direct participation. What I need is testimony. Someone inside the arrangement who will talk. She looked at me. Raymond Voss. She said, tell me about him. I told her. 22 years, monthly reports, never a negative result. Denver office running parallel to the investigation, never disclosed. She nodded. He's the weak link. She said, he's an accessory, not an architect. People who facilitate crimes for money are generally more interested in self-preservation than loyalty. Let me set up a meeting. The meeting happened the next afternoon in Voss's office, a second-floor suite in a building off Shepherd Drive that smelled of old carpet and recycled air. He was a compact man in his early 60s, with the careful stillness of someone who had spent decades listening to other people's problems and deciding which ones to actually solve. He recognized me immediately. He did not stand. I sat across from him and opened my folder, and placed the documents on his desk, one at a time. The same way I had placed them on Claire's table at the coffee shop on Montrose. I did not explain. I let him read. He read the Hoffman and Associates papers first, then the email from 2008, then the Denver timeline cross-referenced against his own reports. He took a long breath, set the last page down, looked at his desk. He talked for 20 minutes without stopping. Gary Hoffman had recruited him in the spring of 2002, 6 weeks after Claire disappeared. The arrangement was straightforward. Voss would accept the investigator position Thomas was offering. He would file regular reports that appeared thorough and committed. He would direct the investigation away from Denver. He would adjust the geographic focus of his reported leads based on information Gary provided after their weekly conversations. He was paid monthly, a separate account, separate from what I paid him. For 22 years. The Oregon situation in 2015, he said, was the most expensive. I looked at him. Oregon. I said, you were getting close. He said, you had found something on your own, a record, a database match. I don't remember the exact details. Gary said you were too close. He needed something big enough to move you away from Denver entirely. He paid $15,000 for that one. I arranged a woman in Portland who matched enough of the description. She was cooperative. You flew out within the week. I sat with that for a moment. Then I stood up and walked out of the office and down the stairs and out onto the sidewalk on Shepherd Drive. November in Houston. Warm enough to be outside without a jacket. Traffic moving normally. A city entirely indifferent to what had just happened in a second-floor office above its head. I thought about Oregon. 2015. I had found something in a database, a partial record that had seemed, for the first time in 13 years, like a genuine lead. I had called Gary from my office at 11 at night, barely able to keep my voice steady. He had come over within the hour. We had sat in my kitchen until 2 in the morning, going over everything, Gary asking questions, helping me think it through, saying this could be it. Tom, this could finally be it. He had driven me to the airport at 5 in the morning. I had a 6 o'clock flight to Portland. At the departure gate, he had hugged me. A long hug. The kind between men who have been through serious things together. He had pulled back and looked at me and said, I hope this is the one. Tom, I really do. He had wired $15,000 to Raymond Voss the previous afternoon to make certain it wasn't. I stood on the sidewalk for a while. Then I took out my phone and sent Claire a text. Voss talked. We have everything. Moving to next step. He drove me to the airport at 5 in the morning. He hugged me, and he had already paid to make sure I'd come home empty-handed. I drove home from Shepherd Drive without destination in mind. That happens sometimes. You get in the car and start moving, and the city passes around you while something inside works through what it cannot yet articulate. I ended up at the house in Houston Heights the way you end up everywhere eventually. By default. Because there is nowhere else. I did not turn on the lights. I sat in my office in the dark, with the folder on the desk in front of me, and let the quiet do what quiet does when you finally stop moving long enough to let it in. 30 years. I have been trying to locate the moment it started, the original decision Gary made. The first calculation. Was it before Claire disappeared? Or after, had he seen the opportunity and made himself available to Sandra? Or had Sandra come to him knowing something about him that I had never known? I could not answer those questions and perhaps never would. What I could answer was simpler and worse. He had known me well enough to do it. To hide a child from her father for 22 years requires knowing that father completely his patterns, his vulnerabilities, the specific geography of his grief. Gary had known all of it. He had acquired that knowledge the same way you acquire any knowledge, through years of patient attention. Through listening when the other person thought you were simply being present. Through Friday nights at a corner table on Westheimer, when I had believed I was being comforted and was instead being studied. I thought about the birthday party. My 50th. Gary had organized it, 80 people. The backyard strung with lights. A band I had mentioned once 3 years earlier and had assumed he'd forgotten. I had stood in my own backyard that night and felt, with a clarity I rarely allowed myself, that I was genuinely loved, that despite everything I had lost, I had this. The evidence of 30 years of friendship made tangible in one warm evening. He had known, that night, exactly what my daughter looked like at 18. He had known she was studying in Colorado, that she was well, that she had grown into someone remarkable. He had stood in my backyard and raised a glass and said things about friendship and resilience that had moved several people to tears. I had been one of them. I thought about Margaret's last hospitalization. Gary had visited 3 times. He had sat beside her bed and held her hand and talked to her about things she loved: her garden, a novel she had been reading, a trip we had taken to Portugal the year before she got sick. She had told me afterward that Gary was a good man, that I was lucky to have him. She had also been writing in a Navy notebook for 2 years by then. I understood now what she had seen that I had not. Not because she was more perceptive, but because she had been looking. I had stopped looking at Gary the way you stop looking at the furniture in a room you know too well. He had become part of the architecture of my life, invisible through familiarity. And I had never once thought to examine what was holding him up. My phone was on the desk. I picked it up and called Claire. She answered on the second ring. I told her Voss had confirmed everything: the structure of the arrangement, the payment history, the Oregon situation. I told her Sandra Okafor was ready to move. We had what we needed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What happens to him charges?" I said, "Conspiracy, obstruction, fraud." Sandra says the federal angle is possible given the interstate elements. He will not walk away from this. Another pause. "Good," she said, simply, without elaboration. "Good." I started to end the call. Then I stopped. "Thank you," I said, "for not giving up, for investigating on your own when you had no reason to think anyone was looking for you." She was quiet long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Then I didn't know I was looking for you." She said, "I just knew something was wrong with the story I'd been given. I couldn't leave it alone. I know that feeling." I said, "I think you do." She said. I ended the call and sat in the dark for a while longer. Then I picked up the phone again and found Gary's number and typed a text. "You free Friday night, the usual place?" His reply came in under a minute. "Same as always." I set the phone down on the desk beside the folder. Outside, Houston had gone quiet in the way it goes quiet after 10, not silent. Never silent, but reduced to its essentials. Traffic on the main roads, a neighbor's dog, the particular hum of a city that does not stop but occasionally slows. Sandra Okafor would be ready by Friday morning. The arrangements would be in place. I had spent 30 years trusting Gary Hoffman with everything I was. It was only fair that I use that trust one final time. I arrived at the bar on Westheimer at 6:40, 20 minutes early. Gary and I had been meeting here every Friday for 22 years, and I had never once arrived before him. He was always there first, always had the drinks ordered, always had the corner table ready with the particular efficiency of a man who understood that small gestures of preparation were a form of care. Tonight I wanted the table first. The bar had not changed in 2 decades. Same dark wood, same low lighting, same bartender who had been there long enough to know our order without being told. He nodded when I came in and had my drink ready before I reached the corner. I told him I would wait on Gary's. I sat down and looked at the table. 22 years of Friday nights. I tried to count what had happened at this table. How many times I had arrived with a lead and left without one. How many times Gary had refilled my glass and said the things a good friend says when his friend is struggling. How many times I had driven home from here feeling, if not better, then at least less alone. This table had been, for 2 decades, the most reliable thing in my life. I thought about what it had actually been. Gary walked in at 7 exactly. He was wearing the jacket he wore most Fridays, dark wool. Well fitted, and he moved through the room with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in his own life. He saw me, registered that I was there before him, and something small moved across his face. Not suspicion, adjustment. The micro-expression of a man recalibrating without knowing why. He sat down, looked at the empty space where his drink should have been. Letting me order tonight, he said. I told him I had just arrived myself. He flagged the bartender, ordered his usual, settled back in his chair with the relaxed posture of a man who had nowhere else to be and no reason to be anywhere else. He asked about the foundation, a gala coming up in the spring. He thought he had heard. I confirmed it. He asked about the Texas Rural Health Program, any new physicians joining the Initiative 1. I said, a pediatric physician from Denver. He nodded. Good. He said, that program needs more doctors. I watched his face as he said it. Steady, composed. The face of a man who had been performing normalcy for so long that it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. 30 years of friendship had given him an extraordinary education in how I thought, how I moved, what I noticed. He had used every year of it. I reached into the bag beside my chair and placed the folder on the table. I did not open it. I did not explain it. I simply set it between us and left my hand resting on top of it and looked at him. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not panic. Gary Hoffman had not survived 22 years of this by panicking. Something more controlled than panic. The internal adjustment of a man who has just seen a variable he had not accounted for and is running calculations about what it means. He looked at the folder, then at my hand. Then at my face. What's that? He said. I moved my hand and opened the cover. The first page was the Hoffman and Associates Incorporation document. His name at the top as registered agent. His home address. The business purpose, private legal consulting and adoption facilitation in the standard language of a document that had been filed and forgotten and had waited 23 years in a county archive for someone to find it. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. His drink arrived. The bartender set it down and moved away. Gary did not touch it. I watched him read his own name on a document that connected him to a company he had never mentioned to me in 30 years of friendship. I watched him decide, in real time, what his response was going to be. I had spent 28 years in operating rooms reading people under pressure the way the body tells the truth, even when the face is trying not to. His jaw had tightened by a fraction. His right hand, resting on the table, was very still in the way that hands are still when they are being deliberately held that way. He looked up, "Where did you find this?" He said, "Harris County Business Records." I said, "It's public information. It has always been public information." He looked back at the page. Then he said, "Tom, I can explain. I placed the second document on top of the first. The email from 2008. He's still looking north. Keep Voss pointed that direction for another month. He read it, set it down. His bourbon sat untouched in front of him, the ice beginning to melt. A small pool of condensation forming on the dark wood of the table we had shared for 22 years. I had spent 3 decades watching Gary Hoffman comfort other people. Now I was watching him try to comfort himself. It wasn't working. I placed the third document on the table. The financial transfer record. Sandra Aldridge's account. October of 2002. $60,000 wired to Hoffman and Associates LLC. 3 months after Claire disappeared. 1 month before a 4 to 5-year-old girl with a T-shaped scar on her left wrist was placed with a family in Denver, Colorado. Gary looked at it. He did not pick it up. I placed the fourth document, the Denver adoption filing. The age notation 4 to 5 years circled in the margin where I had marked it the first night I found it. The date of placement. The name of the receiving family. The Morrison family of Denver, Colorado, who had raised my daughter for 22 years and given her their name and sent her to Johns Hopkins and watched her become a physician. He read it without expression, set it beside the others. I placed the fifth document, the Voss Report Summary. 12 pages, annotated with the pattern of misdirection I had documented across 264 monthly reports. Every time the investigation had turned away from Denver, every false lead timed to a conversation Gary and I had shared at this table. 12 pages of a 22-year system laid out in sequence, each piece connected to the next, with the particular clarity of something that has always been true and has finally been seen. He looked at the pages for a long time. Then he looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at the wall behind me. At some point in the middle distance, that was easier than looking at me directly. I reached into the folder one final time. A photograph. Claire Bennett at the gala in Dallas 5 weeks ago. Navy blazer. Dark hair. Mid-gesture as she spoke to someone across a table. On her left wrist. Visible in the light from the chandeliers. The small pale scar shaped like the letter T. I set it on top of the other documents and did not say anything. He looked at the photograph for a long time. "She came to you," I said. "In Denver. My daughter came to you looking for information about her biological family, and you asked her for $40,000. He did not deny it. You were taking notes." I said, "Every Friday night for 22 years, you sat across from me at this table and you listened to everything I told you and you wrote it down and you used it to keep me pointed in the wrong direction. Every time I got close, every time I thought I had something, you were there, listening, adjusting." The bar around us continued its ordinary Friday evening. Glasses moving, voices at other tables. The bartender wiping the counter with a white cloth. The world entirely uninformed of what was happening in the corner. Gary looked at the photograph of Claire one more time. Then he looked at me. "You always had everything, Tom," he said. His voice was quiet, not angry, not defensive. The voice of a man saying something he had believed for a long time and was finally saying aloud. "You always had everything, and you never once noticed what it cost the people standing next to you." I looked at him across the table we had shared for 22 years. The man who had stood beside me at my wedding, who had sat in my kitchen the night my daughter disappeared and stayed until 3 in the morning, who had driven me to the airport at 5 in the morning to fly to Oregon for a lead he had already paid to make. Certain went nowhere. Not everything. I said, never everything. You knew that better than anyone. I stood up. I gathered the documents from the table, returned them to the folder, picked up the bag. I did not raise my voice. I did not tell him what was coming. Sandra Okafor had been very clear about the sequence of events, and I had followed it exactly. There was nothing left to say that the next several hours would not say more precisely. I walked to the door and pushed it open and stepped out onto Westheimer. 2 plainclothes officers were waiting on the sidewalk. As arranged, I nodded once. They went in. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the November air. Through the bar window, I could see the corner table. The folder was gone. The documents were gone. Gary Hoffman sat where I had left him, hands flat on the dark wood, looking at the space where the photograph of his oldest friend's daughter had been. His bourbon glass sat in front of him, still full. The ice long since melted in 30 years of Friday nights. I had never once seen Gary Hoffman leave a drink untouched. He had taken everything he could from me for 22 years, in the end. The only thing he couldn't take was the one thing that had always mattered most. She was alive. She was a physician. She had his hands. And she was already home. 6 months is not a long time. It is also, depending on what fills it, a very long time indeed. The Harris County Courthouse sits on San Jacinto Street, 12 blocks from the hospital where I spent 28 years of my professional life. I had driven past it thousands of times without ever having occasion to go inside. That January morning I parked in the public garage and walked the 2 blocks in early morning cold by Houston standards, which means somewhere in the 50s, and climbed the steps and went through security and found courtroom 14 on the 3rd floor. Claire was already there. She had saved the seat beside her without being asked. I sat down and we looked at the room together without speaking. The particular silence of 2 people who have run out of things that need saying and have arrived at something that simply needs to be witnessed. The proceedings took most of the day. Raymond Voss testified first. He had accepted a plea agreement, reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation, which he delivered with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had decided that loyalty to Gary Hoffman was no longer a viable investment. He described the arrangement from the beginning, the initial approach in 2002, the payment structure, the system of misdirection, the Oregon operation in 2015. He spoke without apparent emotion, the way people speak when they have made their peace with what they did and are now simply describing it for the record. I listened and did not look at Gary. Sandra Aldridge entered a guilty plea to reduced charges, conspiracy, and obstruction. She was 71 years old and had been in poor health for several years, and her attorney had negotiated accordingly. She did not look at me when she entered the plea. I did not look at her. Whatever I had felt about Sandra over the years, anger, grief, the particular bafflement of someone trying to understand how a mother could do what she had done had settled, over 6 months, into something quieter and less useful than feeling. She had made a decision in 2002 that she had spent 22 years living with. The court would decide what that was worth. I had other things to think about. Gary entered no plea. His attorney had argued for dismissal on procedural grounds and lost. The trial had taken 3 weeks in November and December, and I had attended every day with Claire beside me and Sandra Okafor at the front of the room. And I had watched the case I had assembled in a manila folder on my Houston Heights desk become something that 12 people evaluated and concluded beyond reasonable doubt. The sentence was delivered at 2:17 in the afternoon. 12 years. I heard the number and looked at my hands. These hands had sutured 412 pediatric patients over 28 years. They had delivered news that broke people and held instruments that saved people and signed documents that built a foundation that had provided medical care to several thousand children in rural Texas who would not otherwise have had access to it. They had stitched a small wound on a 5-year-old girl's wrist on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 2002 and made a scar shaped like the letter T. They were. At 2:17 on a January afternoon in courtroom 14, completely still. Not the stillness of control. The stillness of something that has finally been put down after being carried a very long time. Claire and I walked out of the courthouse together into the January afternoon. The steps were broad and gray and caught the winter light in a way that made the city beyond them look very ordinary and very permanent. We stood at the top and looked at Houston going about its business 12 stories below. She said, "What now?" Not as a question exactly, more as an acknowledgement that the thing we had been moving toward for 6 months was behind us, and whatever came next was something neither of us had a map for. I looked at the city, at the hospital 3 blocks north where I had spent the better part of my adult life, at the streets I had driven through 10,000 times in the ordinary course of a life that had not been ordinary at all. "Now we figure out the rest," I said. She nodded once, stood beside me for another moment looking at Houston. Then she said, "Same time next week." I looked at her. She had said it lightly, almost offhandedly. The way you say something when you want it to sound smaller than it is. But it was not small. It was, in its way, the largest thing either of us had said in 6 months. Wouldn't miss it. I said. We walked down the steps in opposite directions toward our separate cars, and the city continued around us as cities do, indifferent and enduring. And the thing that had been broken for 22 years was not yet whole, but was, for the first time, beginning. The law moves slowly. Justice, even slower. But it moves. And sometimes, if you are willing to wait long enough and look hard enough at the right things, it arrives exactly where it needs to. She texted on a Wednesday morning in July. "Coming to Houston next week. Want to show you something?" I replied within the minute. That had become a pattern between us, her texts arriving at unpredictable hours. My replies coming quickly. Neither of us acknowledging that this represented a change from the careful, measured cadence of our early communications. In the beginning, we had been deliberate, considered. 2 people moving slowly around something fragile. By July, the fragility had not disappeared, but we had learned, somewhat, to move around it without holding our breath. She picked me up at 8 on Thursday morning. I had offered to drive, but she said she knew the way, and I should let her navigate. I did not argue. 30 years of being the person who knew where he was going had not prepared me particularly well for most of the things that mattered. And I was learning, at 61, to let other people lead occasionally. We drove south and west for 40 minutes. Out past the last of the Houston suburbs into the flat open country where the sky gets larger and the distances between things grow honest. She drove the way she did most things efficiently, without unnecessary movement, with the occasional observation about the landscape that suggested she had made this drive enough times to have opinions about it. The clinic appeared at the end of a county road, a low white building, recently painted, with a parking area that held 3 cars and a hand-lettered sign that said, Brazoria County Rural Health Cooperative. She pulled in and cut the engine, and sat for a moment, looking at the building with the expression of someone seeing something they built. "I helped fund this," I said. "Through the foundation." "You did," she said. "I thought you should see what it looks like from the inside." We went in. A waiting area with chairs along the walls and a reception desk, and the particular smell of a medical facility that is clean and used and real. A corridor led to 4 examination rooms, a small procedure room, a supply closet, a staff area with a coffee maker and a table with 4 chairs. Everything functional, nothing wasted. She showed me each room with the matter-of-fact pride of someone who had worked to make a thing exist and was not going to pretend otherwise. She talked about patient volume, about the conditions she saw most frequently, about the gap in rural pediatric care that the clinic was beginning to address. She spoke with the authority of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about and had earned the right to know it. I listened and watched and said very little. I had learned, over 6 months, that listening was frequently more useful than speaking. A lesson that had taken me 61 years and considerable loss to acquire properly. We sat in the staff area with coffee afterward. The clinic was quiet, a slow morning, she said. Though the afternoons were usually full, the coffee was ordinary and the chairs were not comfortable, and it was, without question, the best cup of coffee I had had in years. She asked about my residency. What hospital? What years? What it had been like to do pediatric surgery in Houston in the 1980s when the field was still finding its shape. She asked with the genuine curiosity of someone interested in the answer rather than the performance of asking. I had not been asked about my residency in a very long time. I told her about the first surgery I had ever performed as primary surgeon, a 7-year-old with a ruptured appendix. 2 in the morning. A senior attending who had talked me through it with the patience of someone who understood that the only way to become the surgeon you needed to be was to actually do the surgery. I told her about the attending's name, about the particular quality of his voice in that operating room, about the way the child had looked the following morning when I came to check on her, and she had asked if she could have chocolate pudding. Claire listened with her coffee cup in both hands and her eyes steady. "Did you always know you wanted pediatrics?" she asked. "From the beginning," I said. "Children recover differently than adults. They have a particular resilience that is genuinely remarkable to witness. There is something about helping a child that feels I stopped, searched for the right word. Necessary," I said finally. "More necessary than anything else I could think of to do with my hands." She looked at her own hands around the coffee cup. "I understand that," she said quietly. I believed her. The drive back to Houston in the late afternoon took us through the same flat country and different light golden now. Long shadows. The particular beauty of a Texas summer evening that arrives without warning and disappears just as fast. She dropped me at my house on Houston Heights and drove away, and I stood in the driveway for a moment before going in. She had asked about my residency, about the first surgery, about what I had loved about the work before everything else had happened. She had asked about me, not about the case, not about Gary, not about what came next, about me. I tried to remember the last time someone had done that. Still the same house, still the same driveway, still the same oak tree visible above the roofline in the backyard. Everything different. It was a Thursday afternoon in August when the boy came in. 7 years old. His mother said, "Fell off his bicycle on the gravel road outside their house. Left wrist," she said, showing me the wound before Claire had come out of the previous examination room. I looked at it briefly, a clean laceration. Not deep enough to be dangerous. Deep enough to need suturing. I told the mother the doctor would be right with them and went to find Claire. She came out a few minutes later, introduced herself to the boy and his mother with the particular ease of a physician who understood that the first 30 seconds determined how the next 30 minutes would go. She crouched to the boy's level, looked at the wound with a small flashlight, asked him his name and whether he liked baseball, listened to his answer with genuine attention. Then she looked up at me. "You want to observe," I said I did. The procedure room was small and well lit. The boy sat on the table with his mother beside him, holding his right hand. Claire arranged her instruments with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times, which she had. Or close enough. She talked to the boy as she worked, not the distracted chatter of someone filling silence, but actual conversation. She asked about his bicycle, about whether the road outside his house was always that rough, about what he planned to do for the rest of the summer. The boy answered between winces, and the winces grew fewer as the conversation continued. 7 sutures. Interrupted technique. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that cannot be taught past a certain point. It can be instructed and practiced and refined. But the final quality of it, the particular steadiness that makes the difference between competent and excellent, comes from somewhere else, from the person doing the work, from something they brought into the room that no curriculum put there. I stood against the wall with my arms at my sides and watched my daughter suture a child's wrist. When she finished, she showed the boy his bandaged wrist and told him he had done very well, and that when the stitches came out in 10 days, the scar would be small and pale and barely noticeable. The boy asked if it would look cool. Claire said it would look extremely cool. The boy seemed satisfied. When they had gone, she removed her gloves and turned to the instrument tray and began the post-procedure cleanup with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything. I stayed where I was, against the wall. After a moment, she looked up. 7 stitches. She said, "Is that how you do it?" I looked at her hands, the way she had held the needle driver, the angle of approach, the tension on each suture, consistent and correct, the spacing, which was exactly right. 28 years of pediatric surgery, and I had developed strong opinions about exactly right. Hers were exactly right. That's exactly how I do it. I said. She nodded once and went back to the cleanup. I looked at her left wrist as she worked. The sleeve of her scrub top had pushed back slightly. The scar was visible in the afternoon light through the procedure room window, small and pale. The characteristic curve at the top. The shape that an accident of tension and tissue had made on a Tuesday in October of 2002 when she was 5 years old, and I had 7 sutures and 30 years of surgical training and all the time in the world to be careful. I told you it wouldn't hurt anymore. I said, when you were 5, after I stitched it. She went still for a moment. Then she looked at her wrist. Then at me. I don't remember. She said, I know. I said, but I do. I have remembered every day for 22 years. She looked at the scar for another moment. Then she went back to the tray. And I went back to the wall. And the procedure room held the particular quiet of 2 people who have said the necessary thing and do not need to add to it. I drove home to Houston Heights in the long August evening, pulled into the driveway, sat in the car for a moment before getting out, the way I sometimes did, giving myself time to move from one version of myself to another. The oak tree in the backyard was visible above the roofline. Same tree. 22 years taller. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Claire. Saturday coffee found a place near the clinic. I picked up the phone and typed back immediately. "I'll be there." I set the phone down and looked at the house. Same house. Same driveway. The third drawer on the left side of my desk holding a manila folder that I had opened every morning for 22 years. Tomorrow morning I would not open it. 22 years. And she had his hands all along. Saturday morning. August in Houston. Which means the heat arrives before 8 and does not apologize. I was in the kitchen at 7:15 with a cup of coffee I had made myself, sitting at the table where Margaret and I had eaten breakfast for 8 years, looking at nothing in particular through the window that faced the backyard. The oak tree was there, as it always was, larger every year, indifferent to everything that had happened beneath it. I had been sitting there for 20 minutes when I noticed that what I was holding was coffee, not bourbon, not the measured evening drink I had maintained for years as a kind of discipline, a reward for getting through another day of looking without finding. Coffee, a morning drink. The drink of someone who has somewhere to be and plans to be there. I could not remember when the shift had happened. Sometime in the past several months, without announcement. The evening bourbon had become occasional, and the morning coffee had become habitual. Small evidence of something larger that I had not bothered to name. I thought about Gary, not with anger, which surprised me. Anger had been present for months after the arrest, and had done its work and had mostly gone. What remained was something more useful and less comfortable. A clear-eyed accounting of how it had been possible. What conditions had allowed a man to maintain a deception of that scale for that long against someone who was, professionally, expert at detecting exactly that kind of thing? The answer was not complicated. Gary had known me, completely, specifically. In the way you know someone after 30 years of regular, honest conversation. He had known my patterns, my vulnerabilities, the particular shape of my grief, what I needed to hear and when I needed to hear it. He had used that knowledge with extraordinary precision, which meant I had given it to him, not carelessly, not foolishly. I had given it the way you give things to people you trust openly, without reservation. Because trust is not trust if it holds things back. I had been right to trust that way. The problem had not been the trust. The problem had been the person I had placed it in. Don't confuse familiarity with loyalty. They are not the same thing. A man can know you for 30 years and spend every one of those years using what he knows. Familiarity is proximity and time. Loyalty is a choice made repeatedly, under pressure, when there is something to gain by not making it. Gary had chosen differently every Friday night for 22 years. I thought about silence. Margaret had written in her notebook for 3 years, without telling me what she suspected. I had read reports from Raymond Voss for 22 years, without questioning why they never contained a negative result. We had both chosen silence at different times for different reasons, and both silences had cost something. Hers had come from love, the desire to protect me from a pain she could not yet prove. Mine had come from something harder to name, the particular exhaustion of a man who has been looking for a long time and has learned to accept the terms of a search he no longer controls. Silence is not neutral. It takes up as much space as the truth. It makes decisions by refusing to make them. I thought about Margaret. She had known something was wrong. She had not had proof. Only the accumulated weight of careful observation over 3 years. She had written it all down and given it to an attorney and said, "Give this to him when he is ready to ask the right question." She had loved me carefully enough to wait and to make sure that when I was finally ready, I would have what I needed. That is a particular kind of love, the kind that does not require you to be ready for it in the moment, the kind that persists past its own presence. I thought about Claire, her hands on the needle driver yesterday afternoon, the angle, the tension, the spacing. 28 years of surgery had given me very clear opinions about exactly right, and hers had been exactly right in a way I had not taught her and could not explain except to say that some things are not taught. Some things are carried without knowing they are being carried, passed along channels that have nothing to do with instruction or proximity or years spent in the same house. She had grown up in Denver without me. She had gone to Johns Hopkins without me. She had spent 2 years in Kenya without me. She had built, entirely on her own, a version of herself that I would have hoped for if I had been there to hope. Some losses, it turns out, do not take everything. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, picked up my keys from the hook by the door. The drive to the clinic took 40 minutes through flat country going gold in the morning light. I had made this drive twice now. I had a feeling I would make it many more times. I had spent 22 years carrying a weight I could not put down. Turns out I had just needed someone to remind me what I had been carrying it for. The coffee shop Claire had chosen was not the kind of place designed to impress anyone. It sat in a low building on the county road 2 miles from the clinic, between a feed store and a farm supply outlet, with a hand-painted sign and 4 tables inside and 2 more on a concrete slab out front, where a ceiling fan turned slowly in the August heat. The coffee was made by a woman in her 50s who knew Claire by name and had her order started before she reached the counter. I arrived first. Old habits. I chose the table in the back corner with clear sight lines to the door, another old habit. One I had acquired somewhere in 30 years of being a person who needed to see what was coming. Claire came in 8 minutes later with a canvas bag over one shoulder and the particular energy of someone who had already been working for several hours. She dropped the bag, sat down, pulled out a folder of clinic documents, and then looked at it and pushed it aside. Not today. She said, "I promised myself not today." I said that seemed reasonable. The woman behind the counter brought our coffee without being asked. Claire wrapped both hands around her mug the way she always did, and I noticed. As I had begun to notice things about her with the particular attention of someone making up for lost time. That this was a habit she had. Both hands. Always. We talked about the clinic, about a family she had seen twice this week, a mother bringing in 3 children, each visit requiring a translator. The particular challenge of providing care across a language gap with limited resources. She talked about it with the combination of frustration and commitment that I recognized from my own early years in medicine. Before the frustration had been worn smooth by repetition, and the commitment had settled into something quieter and more durable, I told her about a foundation grant I had been reviewing, a pediatric nutrition initiative in 3 rural counties that had produced interesting preliminary data. She asked questions. Good questions. The kind that showed she had been thinking about exactly these problems from a different angle. We went back and forth for a while, her clinic perspective meeting my foundation perspective, finding the places where they aligned and the places where they productively disagreed. It was, I realized partway through, an actual conversation between 2 people who had useful things to say to each other. After a while, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me with the direct, evaluating gaze she used when she was about to say something she had been thinking about. "Did you always want to be a surgeon?" she said. "Or did you consider other things?" I considered internal medicine. I said, for about 3 weeks in my second year of medical school. Then I watched my first pediatric procedure, and that was the end of considering other things. She smiled. Not the polite professional smile, but the other one, quicker, less controlled. The one I had seen twice before and had started to look for. My grandfather was a surgeon. She said, my adoptive grandfather. He died when I was 12, but I remember watching his hands when he talked about surgery. The way they moved, like the hands were still in the operating room even when the rest of him wasn't. She paused, looked at her own hands around the mug. I think that's why I went into medicine. She said, I wanted to understand what it felt like to do something with your hands that mattered. I looked at her hands, the hands that had sutured 7 stitches yesterday with exactly the right tension and exactly the right spacing. The hands that had grown up in Denver without mine to guide them and had arrived. By some route I could not map, at exactly the right place. Mine too, I said quietly. I think that's why I went into medicine too. She looked up. We sat with that for a moment. The ceiling fan turned. The woman behind the counter moved cups. Outside on the county road, a truck went past, raising a small cloud of August dust. She did not say, that's because you're my father, and I inherited it from you. She did not say anything. She just looked at me with those steady, direct eyes, and then looked back at her coffee. And the moment passed into the ordinary fabric of a Saturday morning, without needing to be named. Same time next week. She said when we stood to leave, wouldn't miss it. I said. She went to her car, and I went to mine, and I sat in the parking lot for a moment before pulling out onto the county road. The drive back to Houston took 40 minutes. I stopped at a red light on the highway outside the last suburb, where the city proper began again, and I looked in the rearview mirror at the flat country going golden behind me. The man in the mirror was 61 years old. He had spent 22 years searching for something, and 6 months finding it, and an unknown number of Saturday mornings ahead of him that would look, from the outside, entirely ordinary. From the inside, they would be anything but. Families aren't only made at the beginning. Sometimes they are rebuilt slowly, deliberately, by 2 people who kept holding on without knowing the other one was doing the same. 22 years gone, and 22 more ahead. If I am lucky. This time I know exactly what I am holding on to. I spent 22 years being an expert at finding other people's vulnerabilities. 30 years of building security systems, of teaching executives to identify the threat they could not see, the weakness hidden in plain architecture. I was good at it. I was, by most measures, exceptional at it. I built a career on the premise that I could look at any system, any organization, any structure, any network of people and relationships, and find the place where it was most likely to fail. And I never once turned that same lens on the people closest to me. That is not modesty. It is the plainest accounting I can give of what happened. I had a skill, and I applied it everywhere except where it mattered most. I trusted the people in my immediate life with a completeness that I would never have recommended to any client. I accepted their accounts of themselves without the scrutiny I would have brought to any professional relationship. I told myself this was because they were my friends, my family, the people who had earned something that strangers had not. What I was actually doing was choosing not to look, not because I was foolish, because looking was frightening. Because the questions that matter most are usually the ones with the most costly answers. And there is a particular exhaustion that comes from carrying a loss for long enough that you begin to accommodate it, to build your life around the shape of it. To mistake the absence for something manageable. The most dangerous blind spot is not the one in your organization. It is the one you build yourself, out of trust, out of love, out of the human need to believe that the people who know you best are the people who wish you well. Familiarity is not loyalty. I want to be clear about this because it took me 30 years and an extraordinary amount of loss to learn it. A person can know everything about you, your patterns, your fears, your specific geography of grief, and use that knowledge against you with precision that a stranger could never manage. Proximity is not the same as care. Time spent together is not the same as trustworthiness. The most dangerous betrayal is always the one that comes from inside the house. Do not make my mistake. Do not confuse knowing with loving. Do not let the comfort of long familiarity substitute for the harder, ongoing work of actually seeing the people you have decided to trust. And this, which is perhaps the most important thing I can tell you. If you are carrying a question you have been afraid to ask, if there is something you have been looking at sideways for years, because looking at it directly feels like more than you can survive, ask it. Look at it. The answer I had been afraid of for 22 years turned out to be the best thing that has happened to me in 22 years. The thing I was most frightened to find was the thing I most needed to find. The questions that scare you most are usually the ones that need asking most. I am 61 years old. I have lost things I cannot recover. 22 years of Saturday mornings that belonged to someone else. A wife who died before I found what she had spent 3 years trying to help me find. A friendship that turned out to be something else entirely dressed in friendship's clothing for 30 years. These are not small losses, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I have Saturday coffee now. I have a daughter who sutures with exactly the right tension and asks good questions and keeps her promises about not bringing work to a table she has decided is for something else. I have a foundation that does work she believes in enough to participate in. I have a house that has stopped feeling like a place where time was frozen and started feeling, slowly and imperfectly, like a place where time is moving again. I believe God put me through this for a reason. Not to punish me, not to test me in the way we sometimes imagine tests with a clear moment of passing or failing, but to show me something I could not have seen any other way, that the things we lose do not always disappear, that love, when it is real, persists past the conditions that originally held it, that a father and a daughter can find each other 22 years late and still find something worth building. Families are not only made at the beginning, sometimes they are made slowly, deliberately, out of the wreckage of what was taken, by two people who kept holding on without knowing the other one was doing the same. If this story meant something to you, I would like to hear about it. Leave a comment and tell me what you took from it. Tell me what you would have done differently. Tell me about the question you have been afraid to ask, or the person you have been meaning to call, or the thing you have been carrying that perhaps does not need to be carried alone. If you know someone who needs to hear this today, someone who is looking for something, or who has been looking for a long time and has begun to lose faith that what they are looking for still exists, share it with them. Some stories are not just meant to be heard, they are meant to find the right person at the right time. Subscribe if you would like more stories like this one. I will be here. Thank you for staying until the end. 22 years, and she had been out there the whole time, living, becoming, turning into exactly who I would have hoped she would be. If I had been there to hope. Saturday mornings, coffee, a daughter who has his hands. That is enough. That is, it turns out, everything.